downtime.
Good morning. My name is Maia Miguel, Senior Executive Director for Foundation Relations and Founding Executive Director for FIU Foundation's Office of Inclusive Philanthropy. I am so pleased that you all have joined us this morning for one of many diversity, equity, and inclusion roundtables that FIU Foundation will be hosting throughout the year. We are pleased to host today's roundtable in collaboration with FIU's Wolfsonian Public Humanities Lab. The purpose of FIU Foundation's Office of Inclusive Philanthropy is to work collaboratively with units, in addition to aligning funding opportunities with the university's Equity Action Initiative priorities. The focus of the work is on eradicating barriers related to inclusive philanthropy and providing funding solutions that will help to effect change for our diverse students, faculty, staff, stakeholders, alumni, and community. In honor of Black History Month, we felt that it was important to share a bit of historical context related to the contributions of Blacks in Miami and how 125 years after Miami's incorporation, after decades of systemic exclusion, and through the peak of the Civil Rights Movement, Miami-Dade's Black population remains separate and unequal. What is our role as fundraisers, foundation staff, board members, university personnel, and FIU alumni in helping to address stark disparities through philanthropy? We won't be able to answer this question and others with just one roundtable, but there must be more discussions accompanied by action that will take place this year. More on that to come very soon. At this time, I would like to ask George Korten, Chief Development Officer for FIU Foundation, to introduce our guests and moderators. George?
Thank you, Maia. As Maia noted, this roundtable is hosted in collaboration with the Wolfsonian Public Humanities Lab, who is a recent recipient of a $1 million grant from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, being led by one of today's moderators, Dr. Rebecca Friedman, Director of the Wolfsonian Public Humanities Lab. The grant from the Mellon Foundation takes at its starting point the preservation, creation, and narration of stories within a variety of communities in South Florida. Through archival digitization, oral histories, exhibition curation, and public-facing writing, this project is crafted specifically to ensure voices, many of which have been silenced or marginalized for far too long, are heard and recorded on their own terms and made available for and by the community for generations to come. One of the 8 community partners on this grant is the historic Hampton House. We are pleased to have with us today Jackie Collier, Chairwoman of the Board, Historic Hampton House. Jackie is a creative leader in both the public and private sectors who is fully engaged in her work with a sense of purpose and focused energy. Our second guest is one of our very own FIU alums, Chanel Rose. Chanel is Associate Professor and Coordinator of Africana Studies at Rowan University and specializes in modern American and African American history with an emphasis on civil rights, Black power movements, conservatism, tourism, urban history, and the African diaspora. She is also the author of The Struggle for Black Freedom in Miami, Civil Rights and America's Tourist Paradise, 1896 to 1968. At this time, I'd like to turn things over to our moderator and my colleague, Franz Williams, Leadership Annual Giving Officer and Team Lead for Black Male Initiatives for the FIU Foundation Office of Inclusive Philanthropy. Franz.
Thank you so much, George. Thank you so much, Maia. My name again is Franz Williams, and I am excited to have this opportunity to present really Miami's full history, that of Black history in Miami. So let's start with a primer before we dive right in. You know, every day, many of us will drive on Ponce de Leon or Flagler, maybe even 95. Well, you know, we used to, right? And we are aware of how Henry Flagler has developed Miami. Some other big names like Julia Tuttle and Mary Brickell are celebrated from Kendall all the way to South Beach. Yet, there's histories that are not frequently talked about. That of Black history in Miami, separate and unspoken histories that really set the stage today for our conversation. Now, we only have 60 minutes to talk about the brilliance of Black contributions to Miami's history. So I really want to get you ready for a two-part conversation. The two parts are really going to look like this. In the first half, we're going to explore the history and really how we got to this position today. We're going to look at the impact of the Black diaspora and the challenges they had to overcome. In the second half, we're going to take all of that great knowledge and information and apply it to Black philanthropy, particularly here in Miami. Boosters like D.A. Dorsey, Kelsey Farr, Reverend J.T. Brown can really guide our actions to better serve our current, past, and future Black stakeholders. Of course, our main goal, like Maya and George had said, is to really set a shared understanding for that less than celebrated history, the history of Black Miami, and then an exquisite history so that we as both FIU Foundation and FIU stakeholders can better serve our community members and co-create the infrastructure of equity. Well, let's dive in. I'm excited. Jackie, I'm going to actually start with you here and give you a little bit of a prime. You know, right now, if anyone has seen only One Night in Miami, pardon me, you know that there was just a huge cultural renaissance during the 50s and 60s in Miami for Black culture. And because it was just featured by director Regina King and again on Amazon, we really wanted to start there, Jackie. So could you tell us, what is Historic Hampton House? Why was it established? What role did it serve?
Okay, let's go back just a little bit. Let's go back a couple of hundred years, really, to the 1705 Black codes that were established in order to make sure that slaves stayed in their place and knew exactly what they could and could not do. 1705, the Virginia Black codes basically systematized how Black people could live, how they would be treated, what they could aspire to. So you have in this country the 1705 slave codes, and basically those slave codes also entailed how you make sure that Black people who are in this country live in certain areas and in certain communities, can only do certain things, etc. So, you know, for 200 and something years, we have these Black codes. Then we have the Civil War, and I'm really rushing through history here. Sorry about that. We have the Civil War. The Civil War gives us Reconstruction. Reconstruction just flips everything on its head, basically, in terms of saying that Blacks are free now and can, the 13th Amendment, and they can now go where they want, do what they want, and become, you know, what they would like. There were great strides made during that 8 to 10 year period after the Civil War and during Reconstruction. But during the war, during the next election after that, 8 years after that, after the 8 years, there was an election. And we have a president that comes on board, President Johnson, who says, I will do whatever the South wants me to do in order to get their votes. And the South demanded that they be given, that Reconstruction end, and that people now have to go back to basically pre-Civil War Black codes. But they couldn't call them Black codes at that time. They just called it, quote, Jim Crow. So you end up with the Jim Crow South, but it's not just the South. The relationship, the establishment has now grown throughout the United States. And Florida, just like, it's just like any other state, had Jim Crow laws that basically kept people from, going places and doing the things that they wanted. And especially in terms of where people could live. So, Franz, what you see is that Black people can only live in certain neighborhoods and certain communities, and they definitely could not live in, could not be guests at a hotel like the Fontainebleau or the Doral or any of those, Deauville, excuse me, or any of those hotels that were on the beach. So you end up with, because of Jim Crow, you have to have this separate but equal, quote, that's what it was called, separate but equal, living arrangements and travel arrangements and everything that manifested itself in the lives of Black people. So you end up with Black people needing to have separate housing and separate hotels and separate living quarters, separate everything. And because Miami was such a boom town in terms of tourism, you know, there was a need for hotels that would be able to accommodate them. So you end up with, and I think that the first slide there, you end up with these what are called Green Book hotels. And the Green Book hotels were the Negro Motorists Green Book. And it was written by, it was published by this wonderful guy named, he was a postal worker named Victor Green. And Victor Green was as a postal worker, knew people in all parts of the country. So he would ask them to help him identify places where Black people could live and back where they could go for travel. And so if you look on it, you'll see here where it talks about hotels, garages and service stations, automobile repair, beauty salons, but mostly it was all about where people could actually have accommodations for living. And in the next slide, you'll see that you actually, what you have to do, you call the reservation bureau, going to take a trip, attend a convention, make sure your accommodations before you leave. And the challenge for Black people in their travels was that you never knew where you were going to be, you know, where you might end up, and then not be able to have a place to live. So in Miami, at one point, there were 5 to 7, it varies depending upon the year, Green Book hotels throughout Miami. A few of them that I can name right off the top of my head were the Mary Elizabeth Hotel, the Sir John Hotel, the Hampton House, and those are the ones that were the most prominent. And so you have this really interesting kind of dynamic going on where, and Dr. Rose will talk more about it, where you have Black folks deciding that, you know, enough is enough. I mean, we are able to, we have fought in wars, we've done everything that we've been asked, but we still have this whole thing of separate but unequal. And I'm going to tell you just a little story about the Green Book hotels and what they did in the African American community. Because of Jim Crow laws, African Americans could not swim in any of the beaches in Miami, except the one Negro beach, which was at that time was Virginia Key Beach. But it meant also that little Black children could not learn how to swim because we were not allowed into the municipal pools. As a result, all of the Green Book hotels in Miami that had pools opened up their pools due to this wonderful man from the Carver YMCA who established a relationship with the Green Book hotels so that they would be able to accommodate the children and teach little Black children how to swim. Right outside the door where I am right now, I'm at the historic Hampton House, there was a wonderful pool that taught hundreds of little Black children how to swim in order to accommodate children that just needed to know how to swim, especially since you live on a peninsula. So we have these wonderful stories that come out of Green Book hotels. And in fact, you know the story of one night in Miami where Cassius Clay, after winning the heavyweight championship of the world, came back to the Green Book, came back to the historic Hampton House. And that's where the conversation with Malcolm X, Jim Brown, and Sam Cooke takes place. And you find them trying to make sense of what is going on at this time in the country. So the Hampton House was the home to, Martin Luther King visited the Hampton House and is said to have really started the whole development of the I Have a Dream speech. So, you know, that's about, you know, what we have in terms of the Hampton House. And I could go on forever, but I'm gonna let it go.
Thank you so much, Jackie. I actually want you to go on forever, but maybe that conversation can continue over years, I hope. So this provides a really excellent segue, what you've provided, to the broader historical frame, especially the frame that's provided in Dr. Rose's excellent book, The Struggle for Black Freedom in Miami. So I'm going to just go ahead and quote from your book, if you allow me, and then maybe Dr. Rose, you can give us a little bit of a sense of that transition from the picture that Jackie painted to the larger forces at play later on. Either you can take the 1880s to 1920s, or you can go ahead and jump to the 60s. I'll leave that to you. But here's the quote. Local city boosters, public officials, journalists, and other promoters masked the city's negative attributes by advertising its most attractive features to secure outside business and tourist growth. In effect, they established a tourist progressive mystique that obscured the city's deep racial divide that Jackie describes by promoting its warm climate, sandy beaches, and civil interactional relations to shape America's public perception of this premier vacation destination. So in other words, can you tell us a little bit more and dig a little bit more deeply, Dr. Rose, into the larger historical frame that's reflected in that quote, whether you want to start, like I said, from the earlier years or bring us right up to the 60s and today? Big question.
Yeah. And so I think I'll try and kind of collapse both to a certain degree. So I think part of what I'm trying to address in that quote, when using the phrase, the progressive tourist mystique, is that for the most part, when people typically think of Miami or even its history, right, a lot of things come to mind, particularly tourism, warm weather, right, South Beach, significant Cuban population, but you don't commonly hear stories about a robust Black freedom struggle that really was waged from the late 1900s, right, all the way up to, many would say, the present. And so that freedom struggle, fighting against white supremacy, fighting against Jim Crow segregation, is often kind of left out of that popular narrative. And, what's interesting is that this popular image of Miami as a progressive tourist and Pan-American city that was, presented as being less racially hostile and less homogeneous than other parts of the Deep South. Of course, this was heavily promoted by white boosters, but also embraced to a certain degree by, wealthy Black Miamians, Black tourists or visitors, and even some local and national civil rights leaders. Even though King, right, frequently visited Miami, and he did not ignore the racial inequities in the city, but he often came, whether it was to the Hampton House, as Jackie talked about, or the historic colored-only Virginia Key Beach for relaxation, right, from his involvement in the movement in other parts of the South that were considered, more overwhelmed or confronting and facing the kind of racial violence that you didn't necessarily see it to the same degree in the city. So by the 1960s, Miami had kind of developed a reputation, as the South's most northern and racially progressive city, while, other places like, Jacksonville or Birmingham, right, or even further north in Florida, Tallahassee, they kind of, became marred with social unrest. So the Black freedom struggle and race relations didn't necessarily fit neatly into this kind of popular, racially explosive image of civil rights that we're more familiar with. But having said that, despite the historical and popular image of Miami as this kind of beacon of progressivism and a tourist paradise that differed from the South, we know, right, and many people are more familiar with the fact that it had a long history of white supremacy, right, as demonstrated by its, Jim Crow laws, police brutality, Klan violence, right, bombings that targeted African Americans and Jews and Catholics, voter suppression of African Americans, barring them from the right to vote, right. We can look at the history of the Marcus Garvey, Black nationalist Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association that established a local chapter in Miami in the 1920s, and you had African-American leaders, but mostly Bahamian Blacks who formed that organization. And they had, they were faced with FBI surveillance, Klan attacks, police aggression. So we can see, using, the UNIA and Garvey's focus on self-determination and economic uplift, that even before we get to the 60s, you see Bahamians and African Americans engaging in different ways to address the kind of racial oppression that they faced in the city. And there are many other examples of that, the 1939 elections that took place in the city of Miami, which were really important, where Sam Solomon and also John E. Comer and others were faced with, Klan intimidation and Klansmen, parading through what was then Colored Town, but they still voted in great numbers the next day. So there are just other examples of the ways in which African Americans have confronted oppression similar to other cities and faced similar forms of racial intimidation. And so if you kind of move up into the 50s and 60s, like other parts of the South, African Americans, Bahamian Blacks were forced to attend segregated schools, right? They couldn't receive the same treatment in the colored ward of Jackson Memorial Hospital. They often lived in deplorable housing, right, since restrictive covenants, block busting, and in some cases, white violence kept them confined to overcrowded communities in places like Overtown and Liberty City. And so, I think even though Overtown, or formerly Colored Town, developed a reputation as, the Harlem of the South, because Black entertainers like, Ella Fitzgerald and Louis Armstrong could stay but not perform at the hotels on the beach, they were aware, right, that they had this alternative space, right, in places like the Mary Elizabeth and, with its famous Zebra lounge, but they had been forced to stay there because they couldn't, right? They could only perform on Miami Beach, but not actually lodge and stay in those hotels. And, just as late as 1965, right, local ordinances forced Blacks to carry identification cards on Miami Beach. So I think there are enough examples to show that while Miami is unique in certain ways, it clearly also had many similar aspects that we typically associate with the Deep South, right? So just to kind of say a little bit about the movement in the 60s and then close out here, I think, during the 50s and 60s, Miami became the battlefront city in the struggle for school desegregation. The local Miami chapter emerged as one of the most active branches in the state, right? Even leading to, a sponsored attack by the Florida Legislative Investigative Committee that ultimately went to the Supreme Court. But the local elite became increasingly more preoccupied, right, with securing this vision of Miami that we talked about, this kind of tourist mystique of Miami. And so they took great measures to avoid the kind of racially explosive incidents that developed in other Southern cities, because they knew that, the tourist industry just could not survive the fallout, right? And it would hurt business relations in a way that maybe wouldn't have the same effect on a Birmingham, right? Or another Southern city. So their vision of Miami and economic interests were threatened by Miami core activists, right? Particularly African-American and Jewish activists who formed that chapter, who, organized demonstrations, right? They had picket lines, they had wait-ins, right? Economic boycotts. And so much of that really forced the hand of many of the city leaders. And ultimately, it was kind of, behind the scenes negotiations, right? White civic and city leaders and civil rights activists working together, coming to different agreements about how to peacefully desegregate the city without attracting the kind of attention that racially explosive incidents would attract. And so a number of, downtown lunch counters were desegregated before many parts of the South because of the aid of the progressive mayor at the time, Mayor Robert King High, CORE, NAACP, and other Black leaders. So I could go on. I'll just close out because I think it's important to just briefly talk about the impact of the Cuban influx on how this kind of changes the discourse. And so I think the post-1959 influx of Cuban refugees really changed the civil rights public discourse as Black leaders demanding equal treatment started to voice their discontent with an Anglo leadership that continued to privilege Spanish-speaking Caribbean tourists, especially over native-born Blacks. And in some ways, race relations in Miami kind of serve as a point of departure from other metropolises because of the kind of honorary white status that was accorded some Spanish speakers, particularly Cuban tourists who received service, quite frankly, in certain places of public accommodation that African Americans and Bahamian Blacks did not. And so, you know, despite the relatively peaceful desegregation and legislative victories of the civil rights era, these you know, structural problems continued to, and remained within the Black communities, particularly when it came to education, employment, housing, police brutality, while Cuban exiles were kind of benefiting from the generous aid of the US government during the Civil War. And so I think it's hard to kind of understand some of the way that race relations unfold without having a little bit of that context.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rose, for all of those remarks, so layered and so much to think about. I wanted to just ask one more question in this moment that's related to the end of your comments. You start by discussing how Miami was kind of posited as this like unique tourist destination and so forth, and imagined somehow not as the South fully, right? That's kind of where you started. And then, but now these days, if I can kind of bring us, we think about Miami still as unique and kind of not part of America or part of the Americas, right? And so there is still a way, and I'm going off script here, I hope that's okay. I just want to have a conversation with you. But I'm wondering if you could kind of help us in a way understand that transition. So Miami's continued kind of outsider status in that sense when it comes to all these layered kind of racial, ethnic dynamics. Help us digest these different processes at play as Miami grows, as we get these influxes of new groups and so forth.
So just to understand your question, so how Miami, are you asking how does Miami continue to kind of have this reputation as being unique and distinct as other people from the Black diaspora migrate to the city?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, so this is so interesting. It kind of spills over into one of my other comments, but I'll try not to give too much away here, because part of what so yes, I think that Miami does still have this reputation as being unique and culturally diverse, but I don't know, but I think it's still kind of synonymous with with Cuban or Latin American, like a kind of Latin city. And I don't know how much people are aware of the kind of Black diasporic community when they think of Miami. I mean, people are clearly aware of the Haitian migration and, you know, Haitians, you know, coming to the city in the 1970s, fleeing, you know, political violence, many coming for economic interests. I'm sure some are aware of the Jamaican, you know, community in Miami and their experiences, and some of the other Black diasporic communities. But I just, when I think of that question and I think of, well, you know, how is Miami still considered unique? To me, it seems that even though I've lived it and I'm so aware of all of these diverse Black communities, I still don't know if that is the perception from the outside when thinking about what makes Miami distinct and different. If that answers that question.
Can I just add a little bit, Rebecca? And it's just interesting because just as Black Miami was beginning to grow and move into other parts of the community, because Overtown, remember, if you look at the map of Overtown, it stops at Northwest 6th Street.
Yeah.
Black folks were headed south in terms of, because if you look, all of the migration in Miami goes north. There is no migration south. So Black people were on the verge of moving and beginning to move into that Southwest the South Sixth, Sixth Street, Fifth Street, Fourth Street, Flagler, and into 8th Street, and into that whole, that community there, when all of a sudden we have this influx of people who come in, and it just takes away any opportunities that would have happened. Because remember, the communities were changing in the 60s, and Flagler and 8th Street were open, for new entrepreneurship. And it would have been a boon for, the Black community. But when Cuban Americans came in, it just literally, just knocked us out of any opportunity. And I love how Dr. Rose calls them honorable white, because that's what it was. They became honorary white people, which meant that the rules were different for them than they were for African Americans.
And can I just add one thing too there?
By all means.
I think that, and there's a lot of discussion and talk about, the loss of jobs to African Americans, and there's been debates about, how many, did lose jobs and how many didn't. So I'm not going to dig into that whole debate, but I will say that from my research and from my experience of looking at some of the documents from this time, there were a lot of comments from Black people, not directed or specifically hostile towards Cuban exiles. And I'm sure there was some of that sentiment, so I don't want to, be naive to that. But the frustration and the anger was towards the government, right? That the government, local and national, that now the government, and we know because of Cold War politics and all of that and Castro, but the government had taken this invested economic interest in providing support for those who came. And this is not, and we know, there are different waves of Cubans who come, and the first wave were more of a professional class. And this is not to take away from their ingenuity and the struggles that they experienced when they got here and the hard work that they did. I'm not trying to do that, but I think the kind of infrastructure and support that they received from the government and the ability to attend, and I, as I mentioned in my book, even before that, with the early Latinization, you see, there's a sign where, Blacks and whites had to attend, different beaches, but Cubans could attend either one. So there's kind of, even before 1959, you see the ways in which the early Latinization of Miami is kind of complicating race relations, but not necessarily to the benefit of Black people. But to get back to my point, I think the fact that they were getting support and aid to go to school, support and aid, that Black folk were like, wait a minute, where's our piece of the pie? And I think that's where a lot of the anger was directed. So sometimes when we have these discussions, people get uncomfortable and we're trying to, kind of fan the flame of Cuban Black lit. And it's like, no, let's think about, the systems in place that have created what we're talking about.
And I really love both perspectives, because I think it gives a fullness to things were not always this way, and certainly the economic priorities were not always the same in Miami. And I think in your book, there's something that really captured me. It was a young lady, and you really I only mention this to affirm what you're saying and then transition to a question for Jackie.
Yeah.
But you mentioned about Patricia Stevens Dew. In 1963, this young woman was a member, and correct me if I'm wrong, but a student leader and activist of the Tallahassee Congress for Racial Equality.
Mm-hmm.
Well, here's 1963, she actually gets arrested for staging a sit-in.
Mm-hmm.
In 1959, not at the same location, but in 1959, a Spanish-speaking woman was actually served at a White Castle, enraging all of the white Miamians. And he had basically said, to affirm your point, Dr. Rose, listen, if they pay taxes, we can choose not to serve.
Mm-hmm.
But if they speak Spanish, we have to serve them. So that's a very interesting sort of distinction all the way in the 50s. Mm-hmm. But kind of transitioning, Jackie, I think this one, and coming from our foundation CEO, Howard Littman, something that I'm really, really, really excited to talk about because it's so disruptive, I-95 and the 1956 Highway Act. So could you share perhaps both your sense of what I-95 did to Overtown in terms of disruption, politically motivated disruption, and then some things that might also look like 95 that are celebrated by Miami, but really hold a pain point for Black Miami. So to reframe, just kind of your sense of what I-95 did, Jackie, to Colortown, Overtown, and what was the thriving metropolis that it once was.
It's interesting. It wasn't just I-95. Overtown has been split into 5 different neighborhoods, communities. First, I-95 came down and it went north to south, splitting Overtown in half. Then we get I-195 that comes and takes it from east to west. Then we get the, the Metro Rail that splits all of it again. And so now you have an Overtown. It starts with 95, then it goes with 195, then it goes with the Metro Rail. And so you literally obliterate this community over the course of 15 years. The other part that's really interesting about all of this, and nobody talks about it or pays a lot of attention to it, but the Miami Heat basketball team was supposed to be this boon for Overtown and for the Black community. So the Heat, the old arena displaced over 15,000 Black people because they needed parking and they needed to build the arena and they needed all these other things. And as a result, you now have a community that was at one point close to, I want to say between 50 and 75,000 people living in this community. Overtown is now probably has about 6,000 to 7,000 people still remaining there as actual residents. There was no consideration for that community when they built I-95, because 95 could have been built either a mile west, which would have left Overtown untouched, or it could have gone through downtown, but we knew that wasn't going to happen. And the conversations about how everything was going to be done, it wasn't open. There was no open conversation about, okay, community, come in and have, let's hear what you have to say about this expressway coming through your neighborhood. I just remember, and I was a kid at the time, I just remember us losing our church, our home, our high school. It all just went over the course of 5 years, I think it was. Our church was gone because we knew that we would have to relocate. The only church that still remains that would not sell, and they just kind of built around it, was St. Peter's African Orthodox Church, and it still remains there. It's now a museum, but it's still in that community. But most of the large churches had to be were displaced and they had to move to Liberty City. The school, was basically torn down. It was rebuilt later, but it's gone. And if you look at Booker Washington Senior High School right now, it's on an island. If you look at it from above, you'll see that 95 runs north and south. You'll see that I-195 runs west, east, and west. And then like I said, then the Metro Rail runs straight along it. So you can see Booker T from the highway, but you can't figure out how to get there unless you drive down 7th Avenue. And those are the kinds of indignities, that have happened to the Black community without its consent and without any input, by the Black community. If you look at the articles from the Miami Times during that period, you'll see that the Miami Times spoke out about it because people were really concerned about losing so much, but there was not a lot of, there was not a lot of opportunity to do anything. I think that my church received like $4,000 to relocate and to rebuild, but the church cost a whole lot more than that, to rebuild and to find land and to move. So, I mean,
I was only gonna to not cut you off, but to say I have the quote from Dr. Rose's book of the 1951 Miami Daily News. There were three bombings of African American life in the 1950s, and the white editorial said these acts of terrorism must stop in 1951. So please, Jackie, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Believe me, they didn't stop, because if we go to Liberty City, and you see the 212th Avenues. I don't know if any of you have ever paid attention. I know Dr. Rose knows this, but there are 212th Avenues in Miami, from 62nd Street to 71st Street. There are two 12th Avenues, one for white people, one for Black people. The Black 12th Avenue is like 4 feet lower. The elevation is like 4 feet lower in certain areas. And the white 12th Avenue, it's like you can hide us away. You can put us behind a wall. There was a wall built down 12th Avenue for the separation of Blacks and whites. And in I don't know if, Dr. Rose, you have that in your book. I don't know what year it was, but it was probably 1957, 58, something like that, where there were three bombings on Northwest 12th Avenue because because Black people had moved across 12th Avenue to the white side of 12th Avenue.
Are you talking about the Carver Village bombings?
Yes, the Carver Village bombings.
1951.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, what, 61?
51.
No, okay, 51. All right, so you see these things going on, and it's just a matter of, it's just an act of terror and intimidation. But I think that if you ever get a chance, go to the Black Police Precinct Museum, and you will see that the police were actually recruited from the KKK. I mean, in the parade, you'll see the police on police motorcycles, dressed in their KKK garb. So what does that tell Black people about how you better behave, in this neighborhood and in this community? So, walls were built to separate, streets were built to, make sure it stayed divided. And if any of you ever get a chance, drive down the 12th Avenues. You probably won't be able to see the 12th Avenue, the Black 12th Avenue, because it's, like I said, it's lower, the elevation is lower. And the city now likes to say that was really a service street, a service road. I don't think so.
Thank you. If you would allow, I want to turn to one more question from the audience, and then we can transition to our discussion of philanthropy, because I think this one fits in nicely. It's from our colleague, Michael Hughes. He asked, would you share insight into the Richmond Heights community and how it was special? For either of you.
Okay. Richmond Heights to us when I was a kid was really a special place, because it was so far south until, most people, didn't, most Miamians didn't go down there. Mm-hmm. Richmond Heights came about as a result of the GI Bill. And because they didn't want GIs to be able to use their bill, well, they weren't allowed to use the GI Bill in their to build houses or to live in what would then be necessarily white communities. Richmond Heights was established by one of the developers to make sure that Black people, former GIs could use that. You could use their loans to build houses or to buy houses in Richmond Heights.
Yeah, I would just add, and I think, in Nathan Connolly's book, A World, A World
More Concrete.
Right. He writes more about this and the property ownership and land and so forth than I do, but I do know that it was, I believe, was supposed to be kind of in some ways an alternative, right, to the Central Negro, what was considered or described as the Central Negro District's Jim Crow slums, right? It was supposed to kind of be this suburbia for Blacks, right? With these detached single family homes and green spaces, and a lot of what white suburbia had locked African Americans out of. I think it was supposed to provide kind of an alternative space for that.
And it did to a certain extent. And the other unique and really wonderful thing about Richmond Heights was that their loans, the home loans for GIs, was not tied to contracts, because most Black people bought homes through what was known as a contract. So you didn't own the home. What you had to do was you get this balloon mortgage, and at the end of 10 years, because my parents bought one like that, at the end of 10 years, if you didn't have the money for the balloon, you ended up losing the house, but you could remain in the house. You just had to pay rent on the house that you lived in, and have paid this interest for, I guess, about 7 to 10 years, but you'd lose your home. You lose ownership of the home. You just could still live there.
And we appreciate both the panelists and their candor, right? Their experience and expertise, but we also appreciate that our attendees are asking Q&A, and we will get to that Q&A bank right around 11:45, just to set expectations. But we really want to tuck into the second part of our conversation, and I think that this is going to be interesting for us fundraisers. Research shows, and this is widely accepted, research shows that Black communities statistically give it higher percentages of total income than any other group. And yet there's often a stigma that philanthropy is far from reach. Just last year, $12 billion with a B, $12 billion of Black philanthropic transactions took place. How does this apply to R305? Well, in reading Dr. Rose's book, there was an enormous investment from those early boosters, Black boosters, to the Miami communities. We're looking at D.A. Dorsey, Albert Gibson, Kelsey Farr, Mr. Stirrup, and even Dr. William Sawyer. So those early boosters, as again, Dr. Rose's book really illuminates, they were looking to build schools and homes and real estate for their people, for themselves. So I wonder, Dr. Rose, what could that say for our Black philanthropy in Miami? How could we let me rephrase that. In what way do those early boosters really tell us something about how Miami's Black community likes to get involved?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is a real interest and investment, or people want to invest in uplifting the institutions in their communities. And so when it comes to whether it's, schools or libraries or recreation facilities or, other spaces that will strengthen, institutions that are already there. And I would add with some of those individuals, the role of Black churches, and particularly in historic Overtown, the ways in which they have historically provided much of the support needed in those communities when that support was not there or not available under the constraints of Jim Crow. So I think there's always been, in part, I guess, bitter and sweet, because segregation has forced, or did force, African Americans to, and Bahamians in the diasporic community to live in a lot of the same spaces, to patronize a lot of the same businesses, to really have that kind of self-determination that has been a part of the legacy and tradition of the Black experience in these Black communities. And when we look at some of the areas that we continue to see serious deficits in and continued inequalities in Black communities today, I think that there, we can point to whether it's the Black archives or the Virginia Key Beach Park Trust, or the Overtown Youth Center, or I know that Thelma Gibson has her own foundation and organization that's based on uplifting communities in the West Grove. I mean, I think the list goes on, where you see a continuation of that legacy of different organizations and communities and institutions that are working to try and continue that legacy, but also address the persistent inequalities that many of these places still confront.
Jackie, did you
Okay.
just have any? Yeah,
Yeah,
because go
yeah.
ahead.
I was just going to add to that, that Dr. Rose has mentioned the heart of it, and that one of them is Black churches are amazing. I don't know how they do it. I have not figured. I mean, I attend one, and it's amazing how they come up with and how they raise money and how they build institutions within their churches that do all kinds of good work. Then there's also and that the sororities and the Black Greeks. I mean, they're amazing. They do many of the sororities and fraternities, have huge fundraisers and do all kinds of good works in the community. And if you really look at it, interestingly enough, I don't think that people have paid a lot of attention to what the possibilities for philanthropy in the Black community. And I'll give you an example just from the 60s, 50s and 60s. There's a street in Miami, 67th Street, Northwest 67th Street, from 12th Avenue to, I guess, about 14th Avenue, that was known as Millionaires Row. And on that street were the most amazing homes that you have ever seen. Black mansions built by Black people, funeral directors, entrepreneurs, just some incredible wealth that they were building, for themselves and for their families. And if you see those homes, you would just think to yourself, wow, how did this happen? And it happens because, there are Black people who do have, not a lot of money, but most times they're willing to share it. I mean, and that's why you see a number of churches throughout the communities, because, they individuals and members of the community build these churches and support these churches, and or at least in the past they have. And so that's a lot of, why you see what you see. But, there's just this missing ask, from the philanthropic community of Black people.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's because, most times we're only asked by our churches, only asked by maybe our schools, only asked by our sororities or fraternities. And so why would you give if you're not asked, So.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and if I may, upon reflection, because this is certainly not my show. We want to get the panelists for their expertise, but it really does occur to me after reflection and research, the most important part, that joy, incrementalism, collaboration, these are key hallmarks of Black philanthropy. And I think they really are echoed in the church structure so well. You give to others. I mean, I've benefited and I have benefited others in the same way. Do you need a meal? Here it is. That community giving and service really, that is philanthropy, and yet it's not sort of talked about in the same way. And I pulled this thread that as we start to, and I say FIU and FIU Foundation, as we start to approach this equity work and look for funders, I know, and we have talked about the need for collaboration and for sticking around for tea. It can't be a transaction. This really has to be relationship based, where trust is an element. And I think just having my 2 cents at it, I wanted to maybe throw a quick question your way, Jackie, Chanel, about what could philanthropy do, or how could it be how could philanthropy as an intervention really help some of these things? We had a question from Charles Clark, and he actually posed something. So I just wanted to get your sense. Overtown has such a rich history, Charles Clark writes. Are there plans to highlight the small business economy of rooming houses and bakeries run by Black women in Overtown?
Oh, that's a Jackie question. I wouldn't.
Okay.
I wouldn't know.
Or in another way, hey, describe to us what a platform would mean to some Black local entrepreneurs if they were given, support and platform.
The one good thing that has happened in Overtown that Art Teal put into place back, I don't know, I guess about 20 years ago now, and that is the CRA. Overtown has an amazing CRA, and that means Community Redevelopment Agency, and they have money. And what they have done is invest in Overtown in ways that are just, incredible. They've invested in the Duns Josephine Hotel, the Copper Door Hotel, several businesses, barbershops, bakery, and so there's a diverse group of businesses that are in that third avenue or the second avenue. I think it's the third avenue, the Third Avenue corridor, to include building and working with the St. John's Community Development Corporation on building rebuilding their early learning center and a high-rise complex over there. So there is that from the government. But if you really think about it, how do you get Black folks to invest into or become more philanthropic outside of their families? Because Black people give their families first, because there's always one person in your family that you're gonna go like, yep, we're gonna have to take care of him, or her. So so you always have that. But they're churches, but it's like we have to find out, and I agree with you, Franz, that it is relational. Yeah, it's about relationships. When you talk to people about what's important to them, and what would they be willing to give to, and why, it's the same. It's no different than fundraising when you're talking to anybody. It's about what are people willing to give to, and what are they willing to give for. I mean, I've given, I can't tell you how much to my church, but it's mostly because that church does the kind of outreach and not development, but more investment in young people, and to me that's important. So
Yeah,
that's where I give.
and I would just to follow up on that, Jacqueline, that's been my experience too, as far as what has inspired me to give, what has inspired me to be involved in that way. And I think of when I was in Miami during graduate school, and I worked at the Alonzo Mourning Overtown Youth Center. And, for me, getting the chance to interact with, kids and see how the children benefited from, the tutoring programs and mentorship and computer classes, and the list goes on, and how important that was, or before I left and went on the job market and moved to New Jersey, I worked with the Miami Workers Center, right? Just volunteered my time. And really it was me learning from, these, diverse group of people within the center who were, focused on getting people who are typically underrepresented to get, better wages, better affordable housing. And now, living in New Jersey, not too far from Philly, I donate a lot of my money and time to the I think it's called Power, Philadelphians Organized to Witness, Empower, and Rebuild. And they're focused on fair funding for education and making sure that local Black Philadelphians get training and are hired in new industries. So I say all that to say that I think for me and for many, I think in the Black community, they want to see how their time and their talents contributes to real change in their lives, right? That there has to be that connection there.
And you know, and I'm just thinking about who gives to the Hampton House. You know, the people who give to the Hampton House are folks who don't want to see this history erased. You know, they're just so worried about not having a Hampton House in the future. They're just so worried about their children not knowing about a place like the Hampton House. They're concerned that throughout this whole gentrification thing, that, you know, Black people in the, you know, of the entire diaspora are just being replaced, erased, and, you know, not a part of the future. And they want to see, you know, this place, just like, you know, many others want to see this place remain a part of the community. There's a movement now to get the segregation wall, the race wall restored, because you just can't let that kind of history just be demolished and pretend like it never happened, that there weren't two 12th Avenues, that there wasn't a wall that separated, you know, Black people from white people, that there wasn't a street like 67th Street Millionaires Road that just, you know, that just didn't exist. That Nazarene, which is and Bondstown, you know, two communities that actually had a pogrom, and that's the reason they're no longer around, because the city came in, said that they wanted the property, kicked these people off of their property, didn't pay them a dime, and let MacArthur Dairy build their factory there. So it's like,
And I would just to add to that, Jackie,
Yeah.
just to add to that, Jackie, I think too, you know, in addition to making sure that people don't forget those, you know, historical signifiers of what Miami's racial past has been. I mean, I think, and maybe this is happening and I'm not sure, but ways for especially young people to somehow interact or be connected to some of those, you know, living people who were part of this community. I think of, you know, just briefly when I was doing my research and I got to interview, you know, Enid Pinckney, or I got to, you know, go into the home of Dr. John O. Brown's wife, who just happened to have a photocopy copying machine because she used to work in the travel industry, and we're making copies of all these documents that were in her room. Or, you know, meeting Eugenia Thomas, who was the wife of Lawson E. Thomas, who was a fireball in her own right and just had so much to say and was very adamant about who she would donate her material to. But, you know, for me, growing up in Miami, I was kind of, you know, I went to North Miami Beach High. I was, you know, I celebrated Haitian Flag Day. Like, that was kind of what I was immersed in. So it wasn't until I started meeting, you know, African-American and Bahamian descended activists that it was like this whole world of Miami history opened up. And I just wish there were ways for young people to be exposed to that, you know?
You know what's interesting, what you just said, Chanel, and that is Marie Brown. Her daughter, Gayla, was my best friend throughout junior and high school. And I just remember one time Gayla telling me that she learned how to swim right here at the Hampton House pool. And she told me, she says, Jackie, I saw Jackie Robinson this morning. And, you know, I just looked at her and I said, you know, you're lying. You know, you didn't see Jackie Robinson. But she did. Jackie Robinson had been at the hotel that weekend. And I said, you're just trying to make me feel bad, you know, because I love the Dodgers. So she knew that. And she was just trying, I said, you're just trying to make me feel bad. She said, no, Jackie, I saw Jackie Robinson. So yeah, that's the kind of, those are the kinds of links, you know, that you don't really understand or know about, but they're just so real. And John O. Brown, who was probably one of the civil rights icons in the Black community, and who integrated without even asking the Riviera Country Club, because he could. He just said, I'm going right in there and I'm going to sit down and either they feed me or not. And they ended up inviting him to become a member, because you had to have a member invite you to be a member, to pay $10,000 back in the day to join the Riviera country club up down over in Coral Gables. So
Mm.
yeah, that was my world. Thinking about it now, yeah.
Amazing. Amazing. Well, my hope is, however modestly, our work together, Jackie, will help to restore some of those stories and do some of the work that you are all talking about. It's just a beginning, but that's my hope, and
Yeah.
it's an honor
And-
to consider.
You know, and Chanel, it was nice hearing you talk about Dr. Pinckney. You know, the reason I'm at the Hampton House right now is because of Dr. Pinckney. She was my high school guidance counselor. And I tell everybody, she basically saved my life because I was about to be expelled from Edison Senior High School for leading a demonstration.
And you shared that story privately. And I have to sort of hear for our audience, could you and Dr. Rose share a little bit more about Enid and her impact in the community?
Oh,
Yeah.
go ahead, Dr. Rose, because I could go on forever about Enid.
I think so. I think I met, gosh, I think, did I meet Enid Pinckney? I think I want to
She's
say
like
I met
this
her.
tall, right?
I met her, right. I think I met her through, gosh, it's all bleeding together. I'm trying to say, did I meet her through Guy Fortune and the Virginia Key Park
Probably.
Trust? Probably, because gosh, you know, when I think back of all the wonderful experiences that I had the opportunity, it's just crazy. But I was able to help out with the conducting oral interviews for them, to kind of restore and document this history of Virginia Key Beach. And so I remember this was the time when I was writing my dissertation, and Guy was like, hey, you know, we have so many people on our board, so many people who are a part of what we're doing that you need to interview for your dissertation. And so I think Enid and Dr. Pinckney invited me into her home, and just, you know, just started in her loving maternal, you know, way that she has. And she just started, you know, sharing about, sharing different stories and talking about her experiences growing up in Miami, and what it was like to live, so on the one hand, live under Jim Crow segregation, but at the same time, she would talk about, you know, the wonderful experiences of going to the colored only beach, or the kind of sense of community that she felt in Overtown, even though clearly we know, right, at the same time, there, whether it's, you know, dealing with, you know, housing or poverty or other type of challenges confronting that community, but she still will talk about, you know, the different people in her church, and just really giving this sense of a challenging time, clearly, but also a time in which I think, you know, and Dr. Pinckney can talk about it better than I can, but a time in which she really enjoyed, I think, and you can attest to this, Jacqueline, she really enjoyed her formative years in Miami.
You know, Dr. Pinckney is just amazing. I mean, there are quite a few folks that I would call amazing. I hope y'all saw the Herald on Sunday, where they talked about 6 Black women: Dr. Pinckney, Dr. Fields, who else was there? I can see her, Nancy Dawkins. You know, these are women who are just amazing. I mean, Dr. Pinckney I don't think she's 5 feet tall, but she's like the person who is not going to give up. So no matter how you tell her no, no matter when you tell her no, no matter how many times you tell her no, she's not going to give up. It took her 15 years to get the funds to restore and renovate the historic Hampton House. But do you think she gave up? I think the county thought she was just going to die. So she just said, nope, I'm not going anywhere. I will be here when y'all are gone. So just build the daggone thing, because I'm not going anywhere. And if Rigo is on the line, could you show the pictures of the historic Hampton House this is what it looked like. This is what she had to deal with when she walked in here and said that that it had to be restored. Show the next one. So the whole place had to be reinforced, embraced, and put back together, literally put back together. The stairs are the only things that are still standing at this point. And today, this is how it looks.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and inside that same pool that where you saw all the trees growing out of the pool, that's it. And so, she's tenacious. I mean, she's not giving up, she's not going away. And I don't know why people just don't understand that and just give her what she wants. So
And I would just add, speaking of powerful Black women, and I don't know if it was mentioned in the Herald or not, but some of the unsung heroes, I think of, um, you know, Gladys, I think it was Gladys Taylor, right? Some of you may or may not be familiar with her, but she had helped low-income Black women acquire political representation in housing and welfare programs and jobs, and organized marches on Tallahassee, all right, on behalf of poor Black women. And I think of Georgia Ayers, before the kind of Black Lives Matter movements that we see now, these trailblazers, and Georgia working in the Black community on behalf of criminal justice, but also kind of a liaison between the police department and the Black community. And I just think there are a lot of stories of some of these powerful Black women, particularly those who were not necessarily in the limelight, that also don't often get told.
and the thing that Georgia used to always tell everybody about was the pogrom that happened in her neighborhood as a child.
Yes.
Where they came in and just threw all of their clothes, all of their belongings
In
out on the
Brownsville, right?
street. No, it was
nothing.
colored railroad town, right off of 46th Street. It's almost Brownsville, but it's Alapata. It's really Alapata.
Yeah.
There are 46th Street and 12th Avenue, where the Alapata Middle School is. That used to be a place where Black people lived, and they wanted that property to build a school for white children. And so they came in and they told them they had a day to get their things and get out of their homes. And then the next day they showed up at 4 a.m, some crazy hour in the morning, threw all of their belongings on the street, and it rained. And so they lost everything. And Georgia talked about that all the time, about how the city really owes them. It does. It really owes
and they
them.
used eminent domain, right? That was
exactly.
Yeah.
And
But eminent domain should have at least a notice that you get 10 days.
Oh gosh.
okay. We and this is just getting to the final question before the open Q&A, but I think it actually has a nice connective tissue, talking about kind of what's owed or the historical injustices. Well, we've covered in the first half some of the historical sense, and now some of the historical giving here in Miami by the Black community. So, $1 million question, as they would say, could you just share your open thoughts about the role a large public institution like our FIU can play in better supporting Miami's Black communities through philanthropic partnerships? Open to both panels.
You want to go first, Chanel?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think I've touched on, some of this. I think of, I think that if FIU and you're already partnering with Hampton House, and I don't know if you have, if you are partnered with Black Archives or Virginia Key Beach Trust, Virginia Key Beach Task Force. I think also the I think it's the Thelma Gibson Health Initiative. I think what's important is that a lot of these places are already doing really important work, and they need more support to continue the work that they're doing. So I think, as Jackie had pointed out, whether it's through grant writing or helping with fundraising to maintain and sustain and support some of the work that they're doing. I think of with the Black Archives, whether it's a lot of what they do, especially with historical preservation, is trying to ensure that people who may still have documents or ephemera or whatever in their homes, that they donate that to the archives. And so they would know, obviously better than I do, what areas of need. I'm also thinking, just based on my own experiences, especially at the University of Miami, I know that, I worked closely with Dr. Robin Bakken, And she was very much involved. She was my graduate history professor, and very much involved in civic engagement and really linking the community to university, or linking university initiatives to the community. And I know that, UM had, or has rather, the School of Architecture. I think it's the School of Architecture for Urban Community and Design, but they've worked with West Grove, right? Like on an interdisciplinary kind of collaborative way, where they've worked on the physical renaissance of the area, students who are conducting oral interviews, taking photographs, right, kind of cultural maps, et cetera. And I guess it's needed more than ever. I don't know how much of the Grove or Black Grove is left. I haven't been there in a while, but I've heard a lot about the kind of gentrification of the Grove. So I'm sure much of what they're doing will really be important as that continues. But some of these collaborative initiatives. And I don't know what the School of Engineering at FIU is doing as far as, STEM and the lack of diversity in STEM, particularly African Americans. And I know at other places there's kind of, initiatives and works to focus on that. And I'm thinking it would be great. I don't know exactly what this would look like, but if there's a way to link STEM initiatives to the Black history in Miami, to kind of, have a dual approach to addressing both of those, I think that could be really powerful. As I'd mentioned to Jackie, I feel like, I know at some institutions they have, they sponsor summer institutes where they have, whether it's Miami-Dade teachers and students coming together and meeting with, some of these legends that we're talking about, or even meeting with, the Timothy Barbers and Dorothy Fields, and just gaining more understanding about what it is that they do and the knowledge that they're providing. So it's not just kind of hearing about it, but you have this collaboration of them seeing why this is important, right? Really getting a sense of that history. And especially, I just think there's just been so much pathologizing of the Black community, particularly African Americans. And so I just feel like there's a need to present different stories that don't always just show that one narrative. And so I think that that's really important. I think the last thing I'll say is, is there a way also to partner with some of the social justice organizations in a way where part of what you're trying to do with preserving and promoting and documenting Black history can somehow connect? I think of whether it's, the Dream Defenders or the Miami Worker Centers that I talked about, or, I think there's a group called Smoke Signals that's focused, I think, on preserving Haitian American voices. But I'm just thinking, even if part of what you're doing doesn't focus on the social justice agenda of these different groups, but I'm sure there's a way for what you're doing through your philanthropy to somehow connect with or involve some of these people who have some of those stories that we're trying to share. And it could be kind of this mutual, relationship. So not just thinking about some of the more traditional partnerships, but also thinking a little bit outside the box as far as who you're partnering with and what they're doing, and especially organizations on the ground that are doing real work to affect change. How can you in some way engage with them and also strengthen what they're doing? So I think there's so many different ways to go with that.
One
Love
of the
it.
things,
Love it.
one of the things that I'd like to just say is that, I went to school in South Carolina. And I'll never forget that the governor of North Carolina, I was right on the border from South Carolina, put together this initiative that was absolutely amazing, and it turned North Carolina A&T around. And that is that he sent professors, he figured out a way to fund professors to go into middle schools and work with their students in STEM. And so he did that over the course of, I think it was 8 years. He was in office for 8 years. So I think it was like about maybe 6 years that they had these professors working in partnership with mostly minority and rural communities to really help young kids learn about STEM. 10 years later, you look up and North Carolina A&T trains more Black engineers than any other place in any other school in the country.
Mm.
That's an amazing thing to be able to say, that we are producing, we've got all these graduates in engineering, all of them Black, all these young people are Black. And that's just the Black kids that came out of this engineering program. But,
Yeah.
because it was open to rural, mostly rural communities, you end up with this absolutely incredible, group of young people who graduate in engineering and in the sciences. And some went on to become, other than engineers, but many of them went on to become absolutely incredible, in the sciences. And I thought about what a governor to be able to see that tobacco was no longer going to be the future for North Carolina. And then to think about, how do I bring about real change, not only for me, but for the state of North Carolina. It's sad to say that, that in the Black community right now, we have very few Black male doctors. The year, I think I heard on NPR this morning that the year where there was the highest number of Black male doctors was 1978, I think it was. So it means now that we have this community that is not, that where the investment is not being made in young people, middle schools. He didn't start in high school. He went to the middle school, and he had professors that went to the schools and taught science and taught kids what they need to know about becoming a doctor or becoming engineers or any of those in any of those fields. So
Yeah.
I just say that because it's a model that worked. So,
And I think, Jackie, to your point,
Mhm.
just as a follow-up, I think that this is part of the reason that Miami has been experiencing this brain drain
Yeah.
over the past, right, Jackie, over the past, 2-3 decades, particularly of young African-American professionals who are
Yeah.
moving, whether it's to Broward or Atlanta,
Atlanta.
right? Because
My
they
children
don't.
are in Atlanta. They
So
said they are
for you
not going to compete with Spanish and racism. They can't do it. So they're in Atlanta. They're both doing very well. I just don't think I'm going to ever see them again. But back
Yeah,
home.
that brain drain is real.
Yeah,
It's
it's
real.
really real. And
And
my
I-
grandson is in Atlanta too. So
But I love that sense of, that I took down furious notes, right? But our public institutions, us as humans, us as people, us in groups, can amplify the pre-existing work that's already going on. We can collaborate, we can convene and set a wider table to allow our excellent Black voices and Black culture to really emerge right from that separate and equal history to something that is co-built and collaborative.
Yeah, and I think that's so important, France, just to I think that was one of the key things that I learned at the Miami Workers Center was that, and I think I came in, and there's so much done on this about how you collaborate that I'm thinking, oh, well, I'm coming into, in my kind of paternalistic way with my, all but PhD, ABD self, right? And it was like, no. You need to learn from them, right? They know what they need in their communities. They know where the inequities are. They know, and so I think when you engage in these kinds of partnerships, I think a lot of what, Jackie's, she's right there on the ground, so she's more engaged than I am. But I my sense, especially from the time that I've been in Miami and the times that I go back, is that, many of these institutions, many of these people, they know what those needs are. And so giving and providing support to, effect the kind of change that they've been fighting for, I think is really important.
yeah. So when are you coming back home?
Listen, as soon as Corona lets me, girl. Oh my gosh. Like all my people are in Miami. As soon as I get vaccinated, I plan to come back.
It'll be soon, as they say in South Carolina. Soon come.
Yeah. This Rona has been tough, but yeah.
I just want to sort of chime the bell. I want to make sure that we are conscientious of time. Thank you. And Rebecca, please come on. I don't want to close this alone.
Thank you.
Thank
No, thank you. Thank you.
You know, and just again, on behalf of the FIU Foundation, our alumni board, our foundation board, our employees, our staff, our faculty, and importantly, our Black stakeholders, thank you so much for your candor, your insight, and your time. You really are helping us really dial down on some of the interventions philanthropy can have to protect and celebrate Black excellence. So with that, I'm going to invite Maya to back on to close us out. And thank you again.
Thank you.
This was amazing. The amount of notes that we have taken, the CEO of FIU Foundation, me, George, we've been texting back and forth, so many different ideas. We look forward to having you all back for a part 2, if that would be okay with you. Jackie, we definitely have to come and see you at the historic Hampton House, and looking forward to how we can collaborate, continue to collaborate with you. So thank you all so much. Again, to those of you that have attended today, there will be a part 2, more discussions over the next several months on different topics related to DEI. So we do hope that you will join us. Please spread the word. Thank you again to you both. Have a great weekend, everyone. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.